My name is Keisuke Ida, and I'm Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy here. Before I start my remarks, since there are some of you from the UK, let me express my deepest condolences for the passing of your queen. I received the same message when our former prime minister was killed, so I'm doing the same. It is a great pleasure and great honor for us that we are able to host this inaugural meeting of the Strategic Communications Unit. As you may know, GRASP, Graduate School of Public Policy, is one of the few institutions in Japan which are raising true public policy professionals in Japan. Although we are only 18 years old, still an adolescent, but we are still, we are very internationalized, and we have a number of partnerships with various institutions around the world. Fortunately, we are also supported by many international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF, ADB, just to name a few. But now, the EU has joined to become our new partner through its support for our education and research on strategic communication. In 1918, as you may recall, the EU and Japan signed a strategic partnership agreement to strengthen our overall partnership between Japan and the EU. That same year, the EU launched a project called Enhanced Security Cooperation in and with Asia, or ESIWA for short. It is through this connection that we are receiving generous EU support for our program on strategic communication. So from now on, the StratCom unit will organize various lectures and seminars on strategic communications to bring together various perspectives and experiences from both Japan and Europe. Hopefully, through this joint program, Japanese and European insights on strategic communications can be shared, which in turn will reinforce the EU-Japan strategic partnership and enhance efforts to overcome common problems. I'm such a novice on this topic, but people gathering here need not hear what I have to say about the importance of strategic communication. The problems of disinformation have become particularly acute in the face of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, and I understand one of the purposes of this research program is not only to analyze the nature of information manipulation, but to come up with creative ideas to counter such manipulation. And everyone will benefit from such insights, I'm pretty sure. So today, we'll hear many opinions on this topic from our Japanese and European colleagues. And we are also fortunate to have a lot of Japanese and European institutions which have registered to hear this event, including the Foreign and Defense Ministries of Japan, the European External Action Service, EEAS, and various embassies in Tokyo from EU member states. I'd like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this event today. Thank you.
Welcome to the first public seminar of the Strategic Communications Education and Research Unit, CERU. I am Chiyuki Aoi, Professor of International Security at GRASP and Director of CERU. Thank you for being with us today. This seminar is the inaugural event of the CERU research component, which will focus on the theme of ambiguity as a strategic communications praxis. Following the kind remarks from Dean Ida of GRASP, please allow me to explain the mission of CERU a little further. Firstly, CERU is a global hub of strategic communications experts and educators based in the heart of the Indo-Pacific. It was created to serve the goal of enhancing European Union and Japanese strategic partnerships through the provision of strategic communications expertise and global experience. CERU is couched in a range of EU strategic documents and EU-Japan strategic agreements, most recently the April 2021 EU Strategy for Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific adopted by the EU Foreign Affairs Council, which committed the EU to further develop partnerships and strengthen synergies with like-minded partners and relevant organizations in security and defense, responding to challenges to international security, including strategic communications, information manipulation, and interference. As such, CERU's work is couched in the EU's eastward projection of interests, but the mandate of CERU is not limited geographically. In an era of globalization and hybridization of threats that know no geographical limits or compartmentalization of security threats, CERU is committed to enhancing the strategic communications capabilities mutually of the EU and Japan. We are also planning to attract collaboration from the Indo-Pacific region. Secondly, CERU's mission is to enhance understanding of strategic communications as a central element of our diplomacy, defense, and security studies. Security strategies. This essential aspect needs to be emphasized. Strategic communications are not something that is outside of actual actions we do, such as defense deployments and engagement. Strategic communications are integral to all these actions. Our work starts with the motto, everything we do communicates. If our actions do not speak, what will? Today, I'm extremely pleased to introduce to you a panel of global experts in strategic communications to discuss dimensions of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. It is a timely topic to discuss today when a key security concerns pertains to issues surrounding the maintenance of rules-based order. Here we will investigate the nature and impact of the strategic communications of key global actors engaged in or affected by the war, and consider how these impact our understanding and responses towards developing events. I am pleased to introduce, in order of their presentation, Dr. Neville Boltz, who needs no introduction given his extensive work in the field of strategic communications. Dr. Bolt is a director of King's Center for Strategic Communications, located at King's College London, and is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Defense Strategic Communications, the NATO StratCom COE official journal. He also serves in various adversarial capacities in strategic communications in Europe. Dr. Bolt's contribution will be followed by remarks by Dr. Philip Shetler-Jones, who is a crisis management expert of enhancing security in and with the Asia program of the European Union, currently leading SUS Indo-Pacific facing program. Then we will have a presentation from Dr. Paul Charon, Director for Intelligence, Strategic Foresight and Hybrid Threats at the Institute for Strategic Research, IUSEM, in Paris. A leading expert on China, he has worked for many years in the French government in its relations with China, including as an intelligence analyst and then as a strategic foresight advisor for the French Ministry of Armed Forces. Finally, Dr. Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova is also a leading China scholar and is the head of the Political Science PhD program and China Studies Center at the Riga Stradiņš University, Latvia. She also serves as the head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, a member of the China in Europe Research Network, and the European think tank network on China. We are honored to have equally distinguished experts who will comment on the presentations of these four panelists. Dr. Ofer Fridman is Senior Lecturer in War Studies, King's College London, and Director of Operations at the King's Center for Strategic Communications. Dr. Fridman is also Visiting Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, a prominent expert on Russian information, warfare, and strategic thinking. His numerous books on these topics are well known to us. Dr. Maxime Audinet is a research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Research, ILSEM, Paris. He currently teaches at the Department of Slavic Studies at Paris Nanterre University. His research focuses on the influence of authoritarian states and analyzes their actors, practices, and propagation, continuing from his previous work on Russia's public diplomacy. Also joining us today online is Dr. Aurelio Insisa, Adjunct Assistant Professor at the Department of History of the University of Hong Kong. Trained both in Europe and in Asia, Aurelio's core research focuses on China's contemporary foreign and cross-strait relations by examining the dynamics emerging from the use of propaganda and strategic communications in the context of regional, geopolitical, and geo-economic strategies. He has also authored a monograph on Japan-China relations and has published numerous journal articles. With no further ado, let us begin the panel. Neville?
Thank you. So may I very quickly, just thank Professor Ida and Professor Aoi. It's a great pleasure to be here in Japan. It's always a pleasure to be here in Japan, and it's a great privilege. We feel a great privilege that you've invited us to join you today. So our gratitude, many thanks. I'd like to begin with two ideas. I'd like to look at strategic ambiguity, and I'd like to look at strategic communications and try and work out what's the connection between them. So if we start generally, and then we'll focus in. Humans live in a world of constant tensions. Stability or equilibrium are a trick of the imagination. Our lives move from one cognitive snapshot to the next, connecting and evolving a status quo by which we live. Disequilibrium is the order of nature and the order of political life. But recognizing permanent instability and uncertainty is not how we are programmed to think. Predictability and consistency are more attractive. Now, politics without ambiguity is inconceivable. We desire ambiguity, but we deplore ambiguity. We are creatures of our emotions. We're creatures of our minds. Ambiguity allows precision to be sidestepped. Often we see that, however, as dissimulation, avoiding telling the truth, concealing our true purpose. Yet all too often, we want to read into somebody else's declared intentions or promises what we think we want to hear. And communicators often want that too. Imprecision, a lack of precision, makes politics go around. Strategic communications steps into this unsure world, but for success, it requires coherence, consistency, and continuity. So clearly we have a bit of a problem here. Strategic communications sets out to shift and shape long-term discourses in societies. With its own worldview, it is normative. strategic communicators target audiences who often have diverse agendas, but with the clear objective of changing how they think and behave. It should be according to the audience's desires. It is an holistic project rooted in a set of values and interests, but it is a ceaseless calibration between using persuasion and using force. Yet uncertainty and ambiguity mean that strategic communications also inhabits a world of tensions. So imagine, like two ends of a tightly coiled spring. It lives in a push and pull relationship, each of which cannot exist without the other. They are symbiotic. The two key tensions in my theory of strategic communications are authority and legitimacy, and persuasion and coercion. So two intersecting axes. The two axes, imagine 4 points of a compass: north, south, east, west. This is the moral compass of governance and the social contract. All 4 points speak to each other: authority, legitimacy, persuasion, and coercion. Democracies and autocracies share the same compass. Only the needle will move differently, finding divergent points on which to settle for a brief moment of human history before moving on again. So how authority, the power to govern, might be drawn to coercion, the use of force, rather than to persuasion, the use of attraction, and how that might undermine its legitimacy, the right to govern, will vary. In an authoritarian country, the reading will not be the same as in a democracy, and ambiguity can easily exploit the movements of these magnetic points. In recent years, we've witnessed two conflict theaters unfold differently. Afghanistan's decade-long war showed how mission creep can lead to message creep. A succession of strategic communicators' stories explaining ISAF-NATO involvement led to incoherent, inconsistent messaging, to an involuntary ambiguity, from chasing Al-Qaeda, sheltered by the Afghan Taliban, to destroying the poppy crop while taking heroin off the streets of the West, but also removing Taliban sources of income, to offering crop substitutes in an alternative economy, to investing in bridges, schools, and hospitals, and ultimately to promoting women's rights, then going on to nation building along the lines of an elected liberal democracy. These were all separate messages. All spoke to different audiences inside and outside the country, and all spoke to each other philosophically. But all were too complex to explain how they hung together in a simple soundbite. This was not intended, but unintended ambiguity. Today, the Ukraine theater of war offers, on the democratic side, two distinct stories, not dissociated, but nevertheless different. Ukrainians say they're fighting for the survival of their sovereign state and its independent nation, while under attack from an expansionist neighbor. It's a fight to the death. Ukraine supporters NATO and the EU framed their story from the outset differently, around the existential fight of our times between democracy and autocracy, which is a less tangible proposition. Between these two, an element of ambiguity has opened up. While Ukraine attracts sympathy as a victim of brutal bullying, the NATO-EU proposition, democracy versus authoritarianism, has found little support in the global south, where autocrats, not so dissimilar from Moscow's, show little concern for the democratic project. The gap that emerges between these two propositions, Ukraine's and NATO's, opens up room for ambiguity and uncertainty, a gap that can be exploited in the minds of Western taxpayers and voters whose patient self-sacrifice is needed to fund the continuation of this conflict. At the same time, we see that inside Ukraine, civil society frequently runs ahead of central government communications in a dynamic landscape of digital networks, of smartphones and the internet that map onto flesh and blood networks of resilience. The latter as the cultural consequence of Soviet history. But the nature of digital networks is dynamic, fluid, self-generating, leading to the possibility of instant ambiguity and uncertainty. Communicative surges put themselves beyond control, beyond management, and often even beyond influence, such is their speed of evolution. Strategic communications attempts to bring strategy to this minefield. Strategy is what follows any grand design and its subsequent plan on contact with the real world. It navigates and it negotiates a contingent path through a fast-moving, non-linear environment of frictions and contests. It moves through endless micro-decisions and contradictions that individually, but collectively, undermine the progress of its own communications initiative. Free will meets its match in the marketplace of ideas. Understood in a complex sense in today's Asia-Pacific that faces a rising China, so too is deterrence a way of projecting strategic communications, built on second guessing and double bluff. In short, ambiguity. It's about wishful thinking, but it's also about fearing the worst. Suffice it to say that communications generally is a minefield of perceptions and misperceptions. But when we stand back, we see that ambiguity is inescapable in the pursuit of politics and geopolitics in a world of strategic communications. And this too is our dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Neville, for spelling out the very subtle issues of ambiguity as they are unfolding into very different conflicts. Well, Philip, we turn to you now.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks as well to Professor Aoi and Professor Ida for this invitation. And just mention, I am working in the project ASIWA for the European Union, but the remarks I'll make today are just on a personal basis, not institutional. I want to pick up on particularly the coherence issue that you mentioned, Neville, and the risk that happens when coherence slips, as you mentioned with Afghanistan, and the narrative becomes ambiguous or drifts, and the harm that does to not only strategic communication, but strategy itself. So a couple of hundred years ago, somebody else was thinking about the importance of fixing on the right definition of the conflict you're in. He said, now the first, the grandest and most decisive act of judgment, which the statesman general exercises, is to rightly understand the war in which he engages, not to take it for something or to wish to make of it something which by nature of its relations it is not. It is impossible to be. This is therefore the first, the most comprehensive of all strategic questions. That was written by Karl von Clausewitz. And I think if Clausewitz was alive today, he may even be thought of as a strategic communicator, somebody who thinks of communication as strategy as much as a means of conveying meaning. The importance that Clausewitz put in this understanding, this judging, might be called framing, and Neville, I defer to you, Neville, for the right language to use on these terms, but framing, I think, is important because of the way it relates what is at risk in a conflict with what can be acceptable as a legitimate level of sacrifice for the participants. And in doing so, and this is perhaps more important for us today than it was 200 years ago, it also sets the scope of who are the interested parties and what are the potential alignments and non-alignments in responding to a conflict. So going to a practical example of the conflict we have in Europe, the Russian invasion since February. In some ways, it's not surprising the way that we framed or judged the nature of that conflict flowed from the history of the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It was talked about in terms of territorial sovereignty, integrity, and as Neville mentioned, the threat to a European order which was tied up with the expansion of NATO and the influence of the European Union. What was the result of that framing? Was that deliberate, or was it a framing that was imposed in an unplanned, not a deliberate way, not a strategic way? One of the consequences was it made it easy to frame this as a European problem, or a problem of East versus West, a new Cold War. Allowing that to happen, I would argue, has been a mistake in that it has made a strategic narrative about the wider meaning of this conflict open to attack, because in the wider world, the Cold War was not really cold, it was hot here in Asia. And if you're seeking a grand coalition to respond to the war with Russia, then you need to take account of how other people hear these metaphors. We've heard a response, don't drag us into your war. The Indian Minister for Foreign Affairs mentioned that Europeans have to outgrow the idea that their troubles are the world's troubles. Likewise, with the framing of democracy versus autocracy, this is not a narrative which commands the broadest appeal, considering the complexion of different political systems in countries that you may wish to align with. And so, as you said, Neville, there was to some degree a failure to bring the Global South along this narrative path. Only 38 of the countries of the United Nations have actually so far imposed sanctions on Russia. And when you look at the voting record of some of the resolutions on human rights and so on, over time, this non-aligned Global South or body of countries has remained large or even grown. You saw nearly half the abstentions for the March UN General Assembly resolution, for example, condemning Russian aggression, demanding its withdrawal from Ukraine, were from African countries. At the end of July, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov visited Africa and made the argument that the grain shortage and price rises was on account of the Western causing of the war. And this is what I'm coming to as a way of looking at the timing of this. The visit by the United States Secretary of State Blinken happened in August, and he made a trip to 3 African countries, making the counter-argument. But imagine if that order had been reversed. Imagine if that narrative of a wider, more broadly defined judgment of the character of this conflict had happened first. So I'll take 3 conclusions to consider. International alignment is very important in a conflict where outside parties pursue their interests, not by engaging in direct combat, but using collective economic punishment and coercion. This conflict is playing out in an era where we are still a globalized economy, but one with emerging stronger bipolar competition. Second, domestic framing affects the commitment of resources and political sacrifice. Public opinion is emerging from post-Cold War long peace, sometimes called the end of history, and is not necessarily receptive to a narrative of sacrifice for war. Europe itself enters a testing period of energy shortages and squeeze on consumption as a consequence of how the war has affected the economy and society. And both of these constituencies, domestic and international, are subject to foreign interference and manipulation of perceptions. So practical conclusions from this I would apply would be the timing. Don't let the narrative be shaped by others. Proactively think about shaping it yourself. Preemptive framing, if you like. Second is, when it comes to the domestic, coherence and durability of the narrative needs to be based on a full evaluation of the risks and costs of conflict outcomes. And then internationally, sound out aligned and not aligned before choosing the framing and picking a narrative that has broad appeal. This will be mutually constituted, not top-down or one-sided definition. When we think about how these conclusions might apply in other parts of the world, if we consider the political contingency in this region, what would be the options for framing such an event, and what might be a preferable choice? I think for all of us, a military clash is the last resort, and more likely a preemptive threat of economic sanctions would be considered as a deterrent option. But given that force requires a big coalition to have effect and robust public tolerance for the hit to consumer costs and disruptions, what would be powerful enough framing to make that a successful choice? One is the rules-based international order that we've talked about. Another is democracy versus autocracy. But one we hear more and has, I think, good grounds for closer examination is the opposition to unilateral use of force to change the status quo. But here we get back to ambiguity. So when it comes to the rules-based international order, are we unambiguously saying we mean the rules of the United Nations Charter? Strictly speaking, most member states switched recognition of Chinese sovereignty in the 70s to Beijing. And when you consider the analogy with Ukraine, where there is a breakaway province not recognized by the international community, receiving arms from outside for resistance against a sovereign state, then in that analogy, who is who in this region? Who is in the position of Donbass and Crimea, and who is Kiev, according to the rules-based order? Democracy versus autocracy. It's open to charges of double standards. And of course, when it comes to the rules-based order, that order is neutral in terms of the political complexion of sovereign states. So there's a contradiction potentially between arguing for democracy versus autocracy and a rules-based order. Not to mention the limit to the set of possible aligned countries that you could attract. Status quo protection seems preferable, therefore. But in practice, we have to ask ourselves honestly, do the main players in a potential conflict actually agree that they want to keep the status quo? People's Republic of China, I think, sees growing threats to its core interests and sees a shifting military balance. This is not a status quo perception. On the side of the United States, there is an element who wish to do more to support democracy in the region directly. And there's a repositioning of some of the points of dispute in the region within a strategy of great power competition with an eye to preserving US primacy, checking the People's Republic of China's assertion and maintaining geostrategic structures such as the second island chain. So in conclusion, question of how we would conduct strategic communications in these conditions shaped by strategic ambiguity is a research question, I think, worth looking closer at. Today, when we think about strategic communication, we have to pay attention to what Carl von Clausewitz said, the strategic conceptualization, judging the character of the conflict we're in, identifying it so that we not only take lessons and conclusions from some of our past slips, but maybe more important today than 200 years ago, we have to get better at doing it with others, not just from our own perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for identifying the relevance and significance of framing, drawing lessons from Western experiences in Ukraine. Dr. Paul Charon, we turn to you now.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be a part of this great panel. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine has led observers to question the nature of China's support for Russia. And while China's diplomatic support remains moderate and probably quite ambiguous, Beijing is providing significant support in terms of information warfare. So in this presentation, I would like to focus on the most prominent characteristic of China's information warfare around the Ukraine war. For China, a struggle is underway with the West for the control of narratives. The control of narratives makes it possible to forge the opinions and feelings of individuals and ultimately to influence governments. To win the war, it's first necessary to defeat the minds. To do this, China is resorting to different strategies, and I would like to mention 6 points that highlight this strategy. So, first point, I will call it offering an alternative perspective. China uses what is known in rhetoric argumentum ad numerum, in other words, the argument of numbers. The Chinese authorities explain that while 141 countries were in favor of the resolution condemning Russia, 35 countries abstained and 5 voted against. But these 40 countries, mainly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, represent more than half of the world's population. The underlying idea is that the current system is unfair and does not consider the majority of the world's population. Of course, the Chinese government is a bit quick to forget the diversity of opinions that could be found within this population, but the argument is very strong. Second point, the use of proxies. In its influence operations around the world, China has realized that it's often more effective to use non-Chinese proxies, and if possible, proxies of the nationality of the target country, in order, of course, to increase the power of persuasion. This is exactly what it's doing in the informational battle over Ukraine. The Chinese news agency Xinhua broadcast a video denouncing the responsibility of the US in this war, in which John Peng, a fellow at Bard College, Masood Khalid, the former Pakistani ambassador to China, and Michael Luders, a German writer, are interviewed. The idea is that the message is more convincing because the speakers seems neutral. And it's in rhetoric again, it's a strategy based on ethos. Third point, hijacking Western research, ideas, and concepts. The point here is for China to mobilize studies or concepts forged in Western countries to support some of its statements, to criticize the US, NATO, or other Western countries. To show, for example, that the American media often lie, China mobilizes the results of the 21st annual Edelman Trust Barometer, which reveals that less than half of Americans declare having confidence in the major American media, with 56% of them believing that, and I quote, journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. Let me give you another example. The Chinese media like to invoke the figure of George Kennan, former US ambassador to the Soviet Union, who explained to the US government in the 90s that further expansion of NATO would be the most fatal mistake of US policy, and thus claiming that the war in Ukraine was primarily the responsibility of the US. Fourth point, the use of narratives already well rooted in public opinions. And I will give you only one example, the return of the biological warfare laboratory narrative. China, following and relaying the Russian media, claimed shortly after the start of the war that the US had biological warfare laboratories in Ukraine. This case is very noteworthy because it reveals the level of details and complexity that the Chinese can provide in constructing narratives. Even if most part of the Western population does not adhere to this discourse, the Chinese reach a not negligible audience in specific segments of the population. And first of all, the Chinese diaspora, and also some other segment like far-right movements. What's very interesting also about the construction of this narrative is that the Chinese and Russians also are picking up some components of older narratives constructed by their intelligence agencies, such as the KGB's Operation Infection, which tried to make people believe that the AIDS virus was manufactured at Fort Detrick in the US, or the Chinese Operation of 2020, which tried to suggest that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was fabricated also in Fort Detrick in the US. The ambition is, of course, to confuse the Western publics, to make it doubtful in order to weaken the Western governments. This is even more effective as these media can rely on local intermediaries, local proxies in all countries who support these hypotheses because they are driven by powerful anti-Americanism. Fifth point, campaigning against Chinese journalists working for Western media. For the first time during the war, after the beginning of the war, the Chinese authorities have attacked Chinese journalists working for foreign media, especially Western ones. These journalists are now clearly seen as traitors to the Chinese Communist Party regime, and they are a real concern for the CCP, as its communication strategy is to say that the foreign media cannot report on China objectively and fairly. So this argument loses its power if the foreign media in question recruit Chinese journalists. So now, rather than criticizing the media, Beijing therefore targets directly the journalists themselves. Sixth and last point, Europe is trapped by the US. China has released a new and very interesting narrative aimed at weakening the US-European alliance. This narrative begins by asserting that Europeans need to realize that it's the US that manipulating the security situation in Europe and benefiting the most, while the EU, Russia, and Ukraine have paid a heavy price for the current unbalanced and ineffective security mechanism. For China, Russia has decided to retaliate against American aggression. It's not the aggressor. Here too, China is likely to mobilize local relays to spread its propaganda. And you should note that that in Europe, the Chinese relays and proxies are increasingly the same as those of the Russians, and the Chinese are even starting to work with far-right movements. So to conclude, I would like to mention a few elements revealed by the Chinese strategy around the war in Ukraine. First of all, we can see an undeniable support for Russia despite, in terms of informational warfare, despite a more ambiguous diplomatic posture. We can see also a deepening of the Sino-Russian rapprochement observed for several years on the informational, at the informational level. I will mention also the increasing transfer of narrative material from Russia to China and from China to Russia, as with the infection operation. And also a broadening of the scope of these informational warfare. And finally, deepening of the Russianization of China's strategies, as we can see with the desire from China to reach out to far-right movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Charon, for your exploration of China's narrative use in the context of Ukraine in international context. Una, thank you. It's your turn.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm very happy that I can follow you, or try to follow you at least. And I've been asked to talk about the domestic dimension of the Chinese narratives on the invasion of Ukraine. So, of course, we start by looking at state media. We start by looking at what the stories are put out there, and then maybe I could take you on a journey a little bit, and we could see what if this grows, and how do we flag and measure, and then perhaps we will move to the lessons that Professor Aoi has told us to draw for our StratCom. Well, first of all, the state media is domestically, of course, selectively parroting the Russian story. There are many similarities to what Paul just presented on for the outside audiences, including conspiracies. I'm happy that you touched upon it. The biolab story, but curiously is dancing around and is avoiding the denazification narrative that was so popular. That was one of the Russian kind of right to protect-ish arguments for invasion of Ukraine, because this clearly does not really concern China and does not serve its interests. The Russian video material is very oftenly and widely used in Chinese state media to serve as a background video for newscaster stories. And we've all heard the story of the Chinese journalist Lu Yuguang, who was embedded with the Russian forces in, I think it was March, right? So that, but as Maria Repnikova notes, this was a singular case, and that would lead that this was more of an opportunistic kind of move rather than a state policy of journalism. But of course, this all shows a very strong tilt towards the Russian narratives. Quotes of Sergei Lavrov and information on the high level of bilateral Sino-Russian relationship is there on the pages of Chinese printed media. And of course, China avoids domestically the word war. It's not true that that the state media don't use it at all. But it is used in phrases such as anti-war and you know, war devastation, that kind of thing. But yet the go-to words, if you want to sound like a Chinese newscaster, then you should say crisis, Ukraine crisis, or Ukraine situation. For example, Xinhua site the Ukraine section is called the Ukraine crisis, whereas the China Daily, which of course is not a domestically oriented media, but yet we know due to polls that many Chinese actually read the China Daily website in Chinese, so that still works, calls it the the Ukraine situation. And this is where interesting things start. Yes, there's leaning, but still it invites ambiguity. For example, when we look at the imagery of the Ukraine crisis section on the Xinhua website that I just mentioned, it is a picture of Ukraine's map with Uncle Sam and a bear clawing away at the country. The China Daily Ukraine situation section visual is just smoke, so it doesn't get more ambiguous than that. Now let me talk about what if this grows? What if this takes root? And how do we flag and measure? And this is me out of my depth, because I normally analyze official and media discourse, and it's challenging for me to dive into the public opinion, yet I think in this case it's very important. So let me fall back on some research that my colleagues have done. So just before the war, just for benchmarking, we can look at Jennifer Pan's and Xu Yiting's research out of Stanford, and they used mixed method quantitative, basically long-term research, flagging public opinion in China. And their main conclusion that I want to come back to later is that the public opinion can diverge from the party line, and it is more diverse and liberal than one might expect in China, right? There are plenty of nationalists, but there is also a silent majority in favor of economic reform and political liberalism. And the authors argue that plenty of Chinese are very patriotic, but very few are supportive of war in pursuit of China's goals. Why then there seems to be public support to Russia's invasion? Well, it would appear, of course, that nationalism can be it can be anti-CCP, it can be economically neoliberal, but it is also anti-American, of course. Now to another survey of a project that I was involved with in Europe, the Sinophone Borderlands survey in China. While war with Ukraine was recorded in the responses, it did not appear to have either a negative or positive tone. Only one single response mentioned that Russia attacked Ukraine, and a few respondents referred to as invasion without further details. So this research already after the war had begun shows kind of a detachment from the Chinese public. And the third one, of course, is the Carter Center poll between March and April. The Carter Center China Focus had a poll of Chinese public opinion regarding Russia's invasion. And they had their method was anonymous opt-in surveys to web users. And according to their data, 75% of respondents agree that supporting Russia in Ukraine is China's national interest, and that roughly 60% of respondents support China's mediating an end to the conflict. Now, does this mean that there's very little empathy towards Ukraine, zero empathy? Not necessarily. For example, Maria Repnikova famously has published a review of a narrative, Chinese social media narrative, which depicts the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a romantic triangle. Ukraine is characterized as Russia's ex-wife, who mistreated the couple's two children, Lugansk and Donetsk, and who also flirted with the United States and dreamed of joining the NATO family, but was rebuffed. And this is very interesting because one particular motive comes in here, the motive of betrayal, which rings back very strongly with the Chinese public opinion and with the Chinese online discourse on Russia's invasion in Ukraine. For example, the news that I haven't yet checked, actually, if it's true, but the news that Ukraine is wanting to provide higher status for the English language. And in that piece of news coming out of China Daily, it's almost said as though Ukraine wants a second language, English to be the second language, is immediately shared across the social media as a sign of kind of who do they think they are, or why are they betraying, Russia like that? So no, this does not mean zero empathy towards Ukraine. There's this opinion that the war is very sad. Indeed, it's heartbreaking, to quote a Xinhua editorial on China's stance, but it is the United States' fault. But there is one thing that breaks the wall of such geopolitical cynicism, and that is human suffering. When it comes to atrocities, reports on Chinese social media, that is where true empathy towards Ukraine appears among the media, among the social media users. So human suffering does still ring a bell. Now the lessons. Well, so two things come out of here. Not support to Russia, so I agree with you completely, but rather nationalism and anti-US sentiment. So what StratCom lessons can we draw from Chinese domestic narratives on Russian aggression? China does not want to be seen as Russia's exclusive partner, and that's why it selectively supports messages, creates ambiguity, is of course Russia-leaning in the messaging, but domestically the Russia-leaning stance somehow seems to be stronger. So lesson number one, we can't really, remember in the early days of the war, there were requests from the West for China to somehow, lean on Russia, intervene. We can't do that. That is not the right message. It doesn't come across. The second, that's a bilateral lesson. Lesson two is geopolitical. Don't expect the liberals in China to buy the pro-US and pro-NATO message. Yes, they exist. They do exist, as we know. But the bad NATO message does have support in nationalist China, politically liberal or otherwise. And liberal and critical of the government does not mean pro-US. Safeguarding national interest will matter for Chinese citizens. Anything the US does in the Indo-Pacific will be met with dismay, not by the CCP, but by the population at large. And lesson 3, it's the multilateral lesson. Sometimes we shape our StratCom. When I say we, I don't want to name names, but you probably know what I mean. We shape on this tacit belief that the Chinese domestic opinion is somehow imagined, in the West as a secretly culturally superior towards other developing countries. That what they really want is to be on par with the West, and they're just pretending to like, the other countries just, for show. But I think the public opinion polls show that there is a sympathy and solidarity towards non-Western countries, and we cannot underestimate public support to China's brand of multilateralism, even it circumvents the West. And we have to account for that in our strategic communications. Thank you.
Thank you, Una, for your candid analysis of China's domestic narratives and the rationales. Now we turn to expert reactions to these 4 panel presentations. May I give the floor to you, Ofer?
Yep, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. I have like 5 minutes for reaction, right? Which will be very quick one. So it's kind of more or less to all speakers so far, but a little bit on slightly different topic. And I want to address a term that been mentioned in the beginning and then left to like an elephant in the room, disinformation. Now, disinformation, and in few words, why nobody of us spoke about disinformation. We spoke about strategic communications, and I think this difference it's important to address. Disinformation, by its very nature, is intended to create ambiguity, right? It's directed towards amplification of social, political, economic, and other existing divisions between different actors. It wants to radicalize or mobilize certain audiences. But what we can do about disinformation? What is counter-disinformation, right? Our tools to address it within the framework of counter-disinformation, in fact, are very limited. We can track, we can map, we can deplatform, we can debank, we can pre-bank, and other things, and all is to a very limited effect, because, in fact, the concepts of disinformation, and therefore counter-disinformation, are very linear concepts. They imply there is a evil actor somewhere there in Russia or China or other players who kind of direct it to the audiences, and it's a very linear process, and we all know that social life is anything but linear, right? Now, strategic communications, on the other hand, because it's a holistic approach towards communications, but its very nature is a non-linear concept. It's based on bidirectional relations between communicators and audiences. So when we instead of adopting these linear frameworks, we adopt non-linear frameworks like strategic communications. It allows us to see the wider picture and come up with wider set of solutions to address this challenge. It's not about debunking or pre-banking. It's about what we can do about the divisions. How we communicate and create strategic communications that are intended to bridge the divisions, social, political, economic, and actually deprive the disinforming actors from their targets, right? Therefore, we've been talking here for the last 45 minutes about strategic communications and not countering disinformation, all these linear concepts. Because in this contemporary, globalized, interconnected, highly complex, and anything but linear society, operating with linear frameworks will take us that far. To go beyond and come up with comprehensive solutions, we need to adopt strategic communications, non-linear frameworks that allow us to address simultaneously all involved partners and communicate with all involved partners, communicators and audiences as well. I hope it was okay as a comment. Yeah.
Thank you, Ofer. We are now getting deeper into the concept of strategic communications. Okay, now, Maxime, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aoui. Thank you very much for this invitation. I would like to extend my colleagues' remarks also by getting back to the communicational and the information consequences of the war in Ukraine at a global and a Russian scale, which is very important in terms of how also we conceive and deploy our strategic communication, especially within the Russian society, which is a major stake today. First, it's important to understand that the invasion of Ukraine had a considerable effect on the reshaping, and I would say the destabilization of the information space in Russia and Europe. We have observed over the past month a very strict lockdown of the Russian domestic information space, which is unprecedented in the history of the Russian Federation. It's a process that has been in the making, of course, for several years, but that has been considerably accelerated by the law that was voted by the State Duma on the 4th of March, which, if you remember, criminalizes the dissemination of, I quote, deliberately false information on the Russian military, and which has immediately strongly deterred journalists, scholars, intellectuals from using such words as war, as invasion in the public space. Also, this is a law that marked the coup de grace of the dismantling of the Russian independent media ecosystem, which led to the exile of dozens of Russian independent journalists, which once again has very strong consequences on the way the Russians inform themselves and have an access to independent information in Russia, especially on the war. Also, the invasion very strongly reinforced the process of sovereignization of the Russian internet that was at stake already over the past years. For example, by evicting many Western platforms and by classifying the company Meta as an extremist organization. There are also major consequences on the global information space. As you know, the Russian international state media, RT and Sputnik, have been banned and deplatformed within the European Union. And Western media like the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, Radio France Internationale had to close their offices in Russia or have seen their Russian-speaking branches blocked by the Russian regulator, Roskomnadzor. And my second point, which is also linked because it has very strong consequences in terms of how we shape our narratives to communicate with the Russian societies, is also to get back, because we actually didn't do that, I think, in the conversation. So if I may just give some elements of how the Russians cover this war and what kind of narratives they develop to justify, in fact, what they do beyond the political and material violence of the conflict. So the first one, as you know, is, and it's very well known, is to frame the conflict in terms of a special military operation. Actually, Una talked about it a bit later. There is another central discourse, which is this famous messaging on the denazification of Ukraine, which, beyond the obscene dimension that we have mentioned, relies, and I think it's very important to understand, on a very strongly historical and identity dimension that aims to legitimize the invasion by updating the Soviet great victory of 1945 against fascism, which has a sacred dimension in Russia and is probably the most powerful reservoir of patriotic mobilization for the Russian society. And this is a narrative that has been transposed in the contemporary period, and that considerably, as you know, exaggerates the weight of far-right battalions within the Ukrainian forces. And it is also articulated with this idea that the Ukrainian identity itself as a nation state is purely artificial. Putin, for example, on the 21st of February, just before the invasion, talked about Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine, by suggesting that Ukraine was invented by Lenin. And also a bit earlier, last year in June 2021, he explained that Russians and Ukrainians are in fact the same people, the same narod. And so there is also, I won't be long on this, this last more geopolitical narrative on the idea that the West is in fact responsible for the situation. But I think that to conclude in terms of response of how to produce our own strategic communication towards the Russian society, we must shift our perspective from a strictly geopolitical, geostrategic view of the war in Ukraine by understanding that there is also, and maybe some of you won't agree with me, but there is also a fundamentally identity-based dimension at stake in Russia's invasion that also carries many weaknesses. And weaknesses that can be exploited, that can be used within our own strategic communication and our shaping of strategic narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. We just had further insight into Russian information space and its implication for our policy. Well, we now turn to our online participant. Aurelio, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. What I noticed from the very interesting interventions that we had is a kind of a dark picture, right? Dark picture for the strategic communications of Western and of course also Japan, or we could say of liberal democratic actors. But I think that we should focus also on patience. I think the one issue that could be highlighted here is that it's difficult for, one can argue, audiences, for example, in liberal democracies who contest the status quo are dissatisfied, and they may vote for populist actors either on the left or on the right, but also for audiences in the global south. For them, it may be difficult to reconcile the new reality of that emerged from the war in Ukraine and from the fundamental strategic failure of the Russian invasion, with the very long-held, now deeply rooted macro narratives of the rise of non-Western actors, of the rise of Russia, a resurgence of Russia, I should say, as a political and military power. Or, for example, the idea of impossible to stop Chinese rise, while instead the economic news from China tell us about a very different picture. I even see that in the public discourse in my own country. You'd be surprised of how often, in Italy, you'd be surprised how often people talk about the BRICS as some sort of geopolitical bloc, ignoring, for example, profound ruptures between India and China, and the fact that the BRICS themselves is not a real geopolitical actor. I think this is important, even though we're talking about popular geopolitics, but popular geopolitics matters. The perception that people who are not daily engaged with international politics do matter in this case when it comes to the reception of these narratives. And I feel that we should really think about how difficult it is for audiences to reconcile a reality that did not imagine, that they could not foresee, with their own very long, deeply rooted narratives. And it's in this gap that we could perceive this sense of failure, this sense of about the limitations and constraints of Western strategic communications. But I think that could also be a sign for calling for patience. And I think that often there is a situation of double thinking, where there is an idea in which essentially you want to buy those kind of narratives, alternative narratives that emerge in the idea market, narratives that may be offered by Russian propaganda. They may be then repackaged by Chinese propaganda actors, or, for example, by political commentators, independent ones in the West. You may want to buy those ideas, those alternative narratives, because you want to maintain a certain hold on reality, on the reality that you imagine. And I think that the strategic communicators should also think about this problem, should also think about how audiences reconcile new facts on the ground with long-established realities. And what has been the long-term impact of these macro narratives about the emergence of the BRICS, the emergence of China, the resurgence of Russia, and now they do impact, and they will impact for a long time until reality, the fabric of reality changes. And as, for example, we could see with the emergence of Ukraine counteroffensive now, how facts on the ground will truly clash with the preconception of specific global audiences. And I think this is something that it has to be, that Western and more broadly liberal democratic StratCom agents, actors should keep in consideration. So I would say it's more of a call for patience, if I can.
Thank you, Aurelio, for additional insights about, especially about how audiences may deal with a new reality, information regarding reality. May I offer you the opportunity to respond to some of the expert reactions, if you have any, responses. So should I start from Neville again? Yeah.
Indeed. Yes, Aurelio, I think, is right that we have to be careful not to present too dark a picture. And I'm ever optimistic. I'm a born optimist. And I'd suggest that democracy's strength is also democracy's weakness. Fragmentation is inevitable at times of stress, and we're living through an era of great change. But an open society is always vulnerable to malign actors and forces, but it's also always open to innovation, imagination, and a better life. And can you say that about authoritarian societies? Certainly, in my case, I don't want my son, my daughter, my 3 grandsons to grow old in a society that denies them the chance to determine their own futures, to determine their own freedoms, and to determine their own happiness. I accept that democracies are complex organisms. They're not structures, they're organisms, they're fluid, and they should be fluid. We shouldn't see them as structured entities. And I don't see any harm in saying we should always prepare for the worst, but we should always hope for the best too.
I think I tend to agree, Neville, with your basic sentiment. It made me remember what you said, Ofer, about divisions within society, and are we attentive enough to dealing with that in a way? And it made me slightly uncomfortable to think in an open democratic society that you would need to think about imposing unity in some way or countering attempts to divide. I think a division of opinion and different points of view is completely legitimate, and indeed it's actually, as Neville says, it's one of the positive qualities of an open society. I think it's more the way that you work those divisions out and that they follow civil rules that we've come to enjoy that matters. So rather than opposing divisions, I think I would go back to one of the ideas I was trying to get across when I spoke earlier, which is I think we just need to think ahead and think together in a more deliberate way and invest more in that, so that we don't end up being left behind and having a certain perception of what's happening imposed on us because we were just too slow, or we were just thinking in too small a group, and we were reluctant to really confront difficult ideas and work through them. So I think that would be my response to your response, if you see what I mean. Thanks.
Well, apparently I was given right to response to the response to the response. When I spoke about trying to address the divisions, it's not about going against the diverse nature of democracy. When you're trying to understand what this influence of these particular actors is trying to achieve, they dive into economic divisions. So let's address the gap between poor and rich. It drives into the political polarization, which is highly polarized. It's not about different opinion, it's extreme polarization. Let's try to bring the right and left, extreme right and extreme left, and bridge these things. It's not about trying to unify democracies and then we will lose the very nature of democracy. But these divisions about the access to resources, between the central capital cities and the rural areas. Different opinions hold there and there. These are divisions which are amplified and targeted by these actors. This needs to be addressed, and in fact, it probably will be more effective in addressing their influence than trying to debunk or pre-bank or deplatform their disinformation.
Thank you. I would like to follow up with what Maxime said earlier about the reshaping of the information space with the war in Ukraine. And it's probably more than we can think at the moment, because what we try to do with Maxime at IRSEM is to compare Russia and China, and not only because we are expert on Russia and China, but also because it's meaningful. And why it's meaningful? Because on many aspects, China is learning from Russia. Of course, Russia is learning from China also, but in the information space, China learned a lot from Russia. And at the moment, the changing strategy of Russia in Africa is a very good lesson for China. Why? Because if you compare what China is doing in Africa and what Russia is doing, it's very different. RT, the main Russian media, talk about local problems. They talk to people, to local audience, by mentioning topics that are important for them. But China talks about China. They talk about their success, their expanding economy and powerful, etc. And it doesn't work. And the Russian media are far better than the Chinese media in Africa, and they are much more successful. But it's changing, and now for the maybe 6 months, we have observed a small change in CGTN French. So CGTN, the main Chinese media, has different channels, and one of its channels is in French and mostly dedicated to France and other French-speaking country in Europe and North America, but mostly also in Africa. And they started slightly to talk about local problems, and mostly, and it's much more important, to criticize some concepts like democracy. And now there are a huge part of their programs dedicating to criticize democracy, the state of law, etc. And so it's an important change in the Chinese strategy.
Interesting. Again, Paul, I'm using the thread that you throw my way, that you mentioned democracy, because interestingly enough, there seems to be this kind of contradictory two-track approach from China and Russia regarding this term. On one hand, there's criticism in terms of, liberal democracy, the system that the West has. And on the other hand, there is an active shaping saying that, no, we are the real democracies. And this is something, and it's being put into joint statements. That to me is a very interesting way how these concepts are being taken and proactively filled with new with new content. So as a colleague of mine said, the next concept they're going to take is the Catholic Church. They will become more Catholic than the Catholic Church, which of course is ridiculous, right? So that it just to show how absurd this is. So to me, that is a very interesting avenue of exploration to look into the rethinking for outside audiences specifically of these concepts that we're used to throw around and that we put at the basis of our system. And democracy is one, but others do not come to mind, but I remember that distinctly, that in our research there's more. And quickly, just to say, what has been extremely valuable for me, if I may, because this is at the end of a two-day event, that thanks to Professor Aoi, I had the ability to hear perspectives on ambiguity where I thought one thing is ambiguous, whereas you think, no, it's absolutely clear. And that is regional perspective, and I think that's why we need such projects. And I'm very thankful for you to bringing us together. Sorry for using this stage for these words. Yes, that's me. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you, Auna, so much for your kind words. Well, may I thank the panelists for your very helpful insights. And may I thank you for thank the audience for your very active participation. Thank you. I call the session closed.